The doctor announced my surgery was successful and sent me home, then called back saying, "We accidentally left surgical instruments inside you, and you need to return immediately before sepsis sets in." Dr. Kristen Haverford called 3 hours after discharging me from Mercy General Hospital to tell me she'd left surgical instruments inside my abdomen during what was supposed to be a routine appendectomy. I was sitting on my couch, taking my first post-operative pain medication, when her voice came through my phone tight and controlled. "Michael, there's been a serious complication. We left a retractor and sponge inside your abdominal cavity during surgery this morning. You need to return to the hospital immediately. If we don't remove them within the next few hours, you'll develop sepsis, and that will likely kill you." My wife Nina appeared in the doorway from the kitchen, her face shifting from concern to horror as she watched my expression. I felt rage cut through the fog of pain medication. "How does a surgeon forget instruments inside a patient? You told me 2 hours ago that everything went perfectly." Dr. Haverford's professionalism cracked slightly. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But right now we need to focus on getting you back here before infection sets in. We have an operating room being prepared. Don't eat or drink anything. Come straight to the emergency entrance." I hung up and looked at Nina. She left surgical tools inside me. "We have to go back right now or I could die from sepsis." Nina drove while I sat in the passenger seat, pressing my hand against the bandages covering my incisions. Everything hurt, but I couldn't tell if it was normal post-surgical pain or my body starting to react to foreign objects left in my abdomen. "How could they just forget things inside you?" Nina's voice shook. "Don't they count everything? Isn't that basic procedure?" I pulled up my phone and started searching for information about retained surgical instruments. The results were horrifying. Thousands of cases every year. Patients dying from infections. Massive malpractice settlements. I found one case where a woman died 3 days after surgery because the hospital didn't realize they'd left a surgical sponge inside her until it was too late. The infection had spread too fast for antibiotics to stop it. "They're supposed to count," I said, reading from one medical website. "Surgical teams are required to count all instruments and materials before and after every procedure. This isn't supposed to happen." Nina's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. "Then how did it happen? How did an entire surgical team miss a retractor and a sponge?" That was the question I couldn't answer. A retractor wasn't small. It was a metal instrument used to hold incisions open during surgery. How does something that significant just get forgotten inside a patient? We arrived at Mercy General's emergency entrance 20 minutes after Dr. Haverford's call. A nurse was waiting at the door with a wheelchair, which felt both necessary and humiliating. The pain in my abdomen had intensified during the drive, sharp and burning rather than the dull ache I'd expected from normal recovery. The nurse wheeled me past the waiting room full of people and straight through to a pre-op area where Dr. Haverford was waiting. She looked exhausted and stressed in a way that made me even angrier. "Michael, I cannot express how sorry I am about this. We're going to take you into surgery immediately and remove the instruments. I've already notified the hospital administration, and they'll be conducting a full investigation into how this happened." I stared at her. This woman who'd been so confident and reassuring just hours ago when she'd told me the surgery went perfectly. "You said everything was successful. You looked me in the eye and said there were no complications. How long did you know you'd left things inside me before you called?" Dr. Haverford hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. "We realized it about an hour after you were discharged. We had to verify what was missing and confirm it wasn't anywhere else in the surgical suite before we called you." An hour. She'd known for an hour that she'd potentially killed me, and had spent that time covering her ass instead of calling immediately. A different surgeon appeared, introducing himself as Dr. Raymond Okafor. He was the chief of surgery and would be performing the corrective operation. "Mr. Davis, I want you to know this is being treated as a critical emergency. We're going to get those instruments out and make sure there's no infection. You're getting our full attention." The anesthesiologist arrived and started going through pre-op procedures, while Nina stood next to me holding my hand so tightly I lost feeling in my fingers. The speed of everything was terrifying. No time for questions or processing, just rapid preparation to cut me open again because the first surgery had been catastrophically botched. They wheeled me toward the operating room, and Nina had to let go of my hand. The last thing I saw before the anesthesia took me was her face, terrified and furious, and Dr. Haverford standing in the corner looking like she wanted to disappear. I woke up in recovery 3 hours later feeling worse than I had after the first surgery. Dr. Okafor was there immediately, his expression grave. We removed the retractor and 3 surgical sponges. Not 1, 3. You had significant inflammation starting in your abdominal cavity. Another few hours and you would have been septic. We've started you on aggressive antibiotics and we'll be monitoring you closely for the next 48 hours. 3 sponges. Not 1, but 3. And a retractor. How does an entire surgical team lose track of 4 objects inside a patient? Nina arrived as Dr. Okafor was explaining the situation. She'd been researching while I was in surgery and had already contacted a medical malpractice attorney. "I spoke with Gerald Vasquez. He's one of the best malpractice lawyers in the state. He said what happened to you is called a never event in medicine. Something so egregious that it should literally never happen if proper procedures are followed. He wants to talk to us as soon as you're stable." Dr. Okafor nodded slowly. "He's right. This is a never event. The hospital will be conducting a full investigation. I can't speak to the specifics of what went wrong yet, but I promise you we will find out exactly how this happened. He left, and Nina pulled a chair close to my bed. I've been reading about this. Surgical teams are supposed to count every single item before closing a patient. There are checklists, there are protocols. Multiple people are supposed to verify the count. For this to happen, multiple people had to fail at their jobs. I felt rage building through the pain and medication fog. I could have died. If Dr. Haverford hadn't called, I would have gone septic and probably died in our living room. Nina's eyes filled with tears. I know. Gerald said we need to document everything. Every conversation, every medical record, everything. He said hospitals try to cover these things up. They'll try to minimize what happened and protect their staff. The next 48 hours were a blur of antibiotics, monitoring, and visits from hospital administrators who were very sorry and very concerned and very careful not to admit any actual fault. Each one emphasized that they were investigating and that patient safety was their top priority. Each one avoided directly answering questions about how 4 objects ended up inside me. On the 3rd day, Gerald Vasquez came to my hospital room. He was in his 50s with sharp eyes and a way of listening that made you feel heard. He reviewed my medical records, took detailed notes, and asked pointed questions about every interaction I'd had with Dr. Haverford and the hospital staff. Here's what I can tell you from preliminary review, Gerald said, spreading documents across the rolling table next to my bed. Your surgery was performed by Dr. Haverford with assistance from a surgical resident named Dr. Marcus Leland. The surgical nurse was Jennifer Wu. According to their own protocols, Nurse Wu should have counted all instruments and sponges at 3 specific points: before the surgery began, before closing the incision, and after the patient left the OR. Those counts are supposed to be verified verbally and documented in writing. He pulled out a document. I've already subpoenaed the surgical records from your procedure. Look at this count sheet. He pointed to a form with handwritten tallies. This shows all counts matched. According to their own documentation, nothing was missing, which means either their count was completely wrong or someone falsified this document after the fact. Nina leaned forward to look at the count sheet. If they documented that everything was accounted for, how did they realize something was wrong? Gerald pulled out another document. This is where it gets interesting. About 90 minutes after you were discharged, the surgical suite was being prepared for another procedure. The incoming team noticed they were missing sponges and a retractor from their instrument set. They assumed the previous surgery team, which was Dr. Haverford's team, had taken them by mistake. When they asked Nurse Wu about it, she checked her count sheet and insisted everything had been returned properly. But they kept pushing because their set was definitely incomplete. That's when someone thought to review your x-rays from the surgery. He showed me an x-ray image. Even to my untrained eye, I could see foreign objects that shouldn't be there. Dark shapes where there should have been only organs and tissue. This x-ray was taken immediately after your surgery as standard procedure. The retractor and sponges are clearly visible. No one looked at it before you were discharged. If they had, they would have seen the problem immediately. I stared at the image. Proof that I'd left the hospital with surgical instruments inside me, and no one had bothered to check the x-rays that would have shown the problem. Gerald continued, his voice getting harder. Here's what I think happened. The count was done incorrectly or not at all. Dr. Haverford closed you up without verifying. You were discharged without anyone reviewing the post-op x-rays, which is a violation of standard protocol. When the next surgical team noticed missing instruments, that's when people started panicking and realized what happened. Dr. Haverford waited an hour before calling you, probably consulting with hospital lawyers about how to handle the situation. Every step of this represents catastrophic failure. Nina asked the question I was thinking. Can we sue them? Gerald nodded. Absolutely. This is textbook medical malpractice. Retained surgical instruments, failure to follow counting protocols, failure to review post-operative x-rays, delay in notifying you about the complication. We have multiple violations of standard care. The question isn't whether we can win, it's how much we can win. He pulled out a legal pad. I need you to understand what we're up against. Mercy General is owned by Apex Healthcare Systems. They're a massive hospital corporation with enormous resources and aggressive legal teams. They will fight this, not because they think they can win, but because they want to minimize the settlement. Every dollar we get comes out of their reputation and their insurance premiums. Over the next week while I recovered in the hospital, Gerald worked to build our case. He interviewed the surgical team, subpoenaed records, and talked to other patients who'd had surgeries at Mercy General. What he found was disturbing. Dr. Haverford was relatively new to Mercy General, hired 6 months ago after leaving her previous hospital under unclear circumstances. Gerald's investigator found that she'd had a similar incident at her previous hospital, a surgical sponge left in a patient during a gallbladder removal. That patient had sued and settled for an undisclosed amount. Mercy General had either not known about this or had hired her anyway. The surgical resident, Dr. Marcus Leland, was in his final year of training. He told Gerald in an interview that he'd raised concerns during my surgery about the sponge count seeming off, but Dr. Haverford had dismissed him. He'd been afraid to push back against an attending surgeon and had ultimately deferred to her judgment. Nurse Jennifer Wu had been working double shifts due to staffing shortages. She admitted in her deposition that she'd been exhausted and might have miscounted. She also said Dr. Haverford had pressured her to move faster during the closing process because they were running behind schedule. The picture that emerged was one of systemic failure, an inexperienced surgeon with a history of similar mistakes, a resident too intimidated to challenge her, a nurse too overworked to do her job properly, a hospital that didn't review post-operative x-rays before discharging patients, and administrators who waited an hour before calling me, potentially sacrificing my life to consult with lawyers. Gerald filed the lawsuit 3 weeks after my surgery. We sued Dr. Haverford, Mercy General Hospital, and Apex Healthcare Systems for medical malpractice, negligence, and emotional distress. The damages we requested were $5 million. The lawsuit made news. Local reporters picked up the story, interviewing me about what happened. I told them everything, about waking up from surgery being told everything was perfect, about getting the call 3 hours later that I might die from sepsis, about the retractor and 3 sponges left inside me. Mercy General issued a statement saying they took patient safety seriously and were conducting a thorough investigation. They didn't admit fault or apologize. They just expressed concern and promised to review their procedures. It was corporate damage control, nothing more. The discovery process revealed even more damaging information. Internal emails showed that Mercy General administrators knew Dr. Haverford had issues with surgical counts. 2 other surgeries in her 6 months at the hospital had resulted in count discrepancies that had been caught before closing the patient, but were significant enough that they should have raised red flags. The hospital had addressed these through additional training but hadn't removed her from surgery or increased oversight. Gerald found something even more damning in Mercy General's financial records. The hospital was under intense pressure from Apex Healthcare Systems to increase surgical volume and reduce procedure times. Surgeons were being evaluated partly on how quickly they could complete operations. Dr. Haverford had been praised in performance reviews for her efficiency and speed. The system was literally incentivizing rushing through surgeries. The hospital's insurance company tried to settle quickly. They offered $500,000 2 months into the lawsuit. Gerald advised me to reject it. They're lowballing because they know we have them cold. They want to settle before more information comes out. If we go to trial, a jury will award significantly more. We rejected the offer, and the hospital's legal team shifted tactics. They started attacking me personally. Their lawyers requested my complete medical history, looking for pre-existing conditions they could blame for my complications. They questioned whether I'd followed post-operative instructions properly. They even suggested that maybe I'd had symptoms before I left the hospital and hadn't reported them. It was character assassination dressed up as legal defense. Gerald had warned me this would happen. They're trying to shift blame to you because they can't defend what they did. It's despicable, but it's standard practice in medical malpractice defense. Don't let it get to you. We have the facts on our side. But it did get to me. Reading depositions where hospital lawyers implied I was partly responsible for having surgical instruments left inside me was infuriating. Nina was even angrier. They almost killed you through their negligence, and now they're trying to make it sound like it's your fault? This is exactly why people hate hospitals and lawyers. 4 months into the lawsuit, Gerald found our smoking gun. A whistleblower from inside Mercy General, a surgical nurse who'd worked with Dr. Haverford, contacted us with information. She had documentation of multiple instances where Dr. Haverford had skipped count procedures or pressured nurses to falsify count sheets when surgeries ran long. The whistleblower's name was Patricia Ossie, and she'd been working at Mercy General for 12 years. Patricia met with us and Gerald in a conference room downtown. She brought a folder of documents she'd carefully compiled over 6 months. I started documenting after the 3rd time I saw Dr. Haverford skip protocol. I knew eventually something terrible would happen. When I heard about your case, I knew I had to come forward. She showed us incident reports she'd filed internally about Dr. Haverford's behavior. Every single one had been dismissed by hospital administration with notes saying the complaints were unsubstantiated or that additional training had been provided. Patricia had documentation of at least 6 surgeries where counts were questionable, but patients were closed up anyway. I asked her why she'd waited to come forward. Patricia's expression was pained. Because I have 2 kids and a mortgage, and Mercy General is the best-paying hospital in this area. Speaking out against an attending surgeon can end a nurse's career. I filed reports through proper channels and was told to drop it. If I pushed harder, I'd have been fired and blacklisted. But when I heard you almost died, I couldn't stay silent anymore. Gerald immediately filed a motion to add Patricia's evidence to our case. The hospital's lawyers fought viciously to suppress it, arguing it was inadmissible hearsay and that Patricia was a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. The judge disagreed. He ruled that Patricia's contemporaneous documentation and internal incident reports were admissible and directly relevant to establishing a pattern of negligence. The trial was scheduled for 8 months after my surgery. The hospital made one more settlement offer before trial, $2.5 million. Gerald said we should consider it seriously. Trials are unpredictable. Juries can be sympathetic or they can surprise you. This is a substantial offer. Nina and I talked about it for days. The money would be life-changing. I'd lost my job during recovery because my employer couldn't hold my position for the extended leave I needed. We had medical bills piling up even with insurance. The settlement would solve our immediate financial problems, but it would also come with a confidentiality agreement. We wouldn't be allowed to talk about what happened. The hospital would issue a statement saying the case was resolved to everyone's satisfaction with no admission of wrongdoing. Dr. Haverford would continue practicing surgery. Patricia Osei's evidence would be sealed. Nothing would change. I told Gerald we were going to trial. This isn't just about money anymore. If we settle quietly, Dr. Haverford will do this to someone else. The hospital will keep pressuring surgeons to work faster. Nothing will change unless we force it to change. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Gerald systematically presented our case, walking the jury through every failure, every violation of protocol, every warning sign that was ignored. He showed them the X-ray with clear images of the retractor and sponges inside me. He played the recording of Dr. Haverford's phone call, telling me to come back to the hospital. He presented Patricia's documentation of Dr. Haverford's pattern of skipping safety procedures. He showed internal emails where hospital administrators discussed reducing surgical times to increase revenue. Dr. Haverford took the stand and tried to defend herself. She claimed the count had been done correctly, but there must have been a clerical error. She insisted she'd called me as soon as she'd realized the problem. She said she'd always prioritized patient safety, and this was a tragic accident that could happen to anyone. Gerald destroyed her on cross-examination. He showed her own notes from my surgery indicating she'd been rushing because she had another procedure scheduled immediately after mine. He presented evidence of the previous sponge incident at her former hospital. He asked her directly why she'd waited an hour to call me after discovering instruments were missing. She stammered that she'd needed to verify the situation before alarming me unnecessarily. Gerald asked if she'd considered that every minute she waited was a minute closer to me developing potentially fatal sepsis. She had no good answer. The hospital's lawyers tried to argue that while mistakes were made, the important thing was that the problem was caught and corrected before I suffered permanent harm. They emphasized that I'd made a full recovery and that the hospital had implemented new procedures to prevent similar incidents. Gerald countered in his closing argument. The defense wants you to focus on the fact that Michael Davis survived. They want you to forget that he almost died because multiple people failed at their jobs. They want you to ignore that he was sent home with 4 surgical instruments inside him because a surgeon was rushing and a hospital was prioritizing profit over safety. They want you to believe this was an unfortunate accident. But the evidence shows this was inevitable. When you pressure surgeons to work faster, when you ignore warning signs, when you dismiss nurses who raise concerns, eventually someone gets hurt. Michael was lucky. He survived. The next patient might not be. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they came back, the forewoman read the verdict. We found in favor of the plaintiff on all counts. We award economic damages of $800,000 for medical expenses and lost income. We award non-economic damages of $3.2 million for pain and suffering. And we award punitive damages of $8 million to punish the defendants for reckless disregard of patient safety. $12 million total. Gerald had told me that punitive damages were rare in medical malpractice cases. Juries usually stuck to compensating actual damages. But this jury had been so appalled by the evidence that they'd decided to punish the hospital. The verdict made national news. Medical safety advocates held it up as an example of accountability for never events. Patient safety organizations used our case in training materials. The hospital appealed, which we expected. Their lawyers argued the punitive damages were excessive and should be reduced. The appeals court disagreed. They upheld the verdict in full, noting in their decision that the evidence showed a systemic pattern of prioritizing efficiency over safety that warranted significant punishment. Mercy General and Apex healthcare systems paid the full $12 million. They also made changes, some voluntary and some forced by the state medical board. Dr. Haverford's medical license was suspended for 2 years, and she was required to undergo additional training and supervision before being allowed to practice surgery again. The hospital implemented mandatory X-ray reviews before any surgical patient could be discharged. They hired additional nursing staff to address the shortage issues. They ended the policy of evaluating surgeons based on procedure speed. Patricia Osei was promoted to a patient safety oversight position where she could review surgical procedures and flag concerns without fear of retaliation. But none of those changes brought back the 3 months of pain and fear I'd experienced, the nightmares I still had about waking up septic and dying, or the fundamental loss of trust in medical professionals. 2 years after the surgery, Nina and I used some of the settlement money to start a non-profit organization focused on surgical safety and patient advocacy. We worked with hospitals to implement better counting procedures and to create channels for nurses and residents to report safety concerns without career consequences. We testified before state medical boards about the need for stricter oversight of surgeons with histories of complications. We partnered with other patients who'd been victims of never events to share our stories and push for systemic change. I still have scars from both surgeries, the first one that went catastrophically wrong and the second one that saved my life. Every time I see them, I remember Dr. Haverford's voice on the phone telling me I needed to come back immediately before sepsis killed me. And I remember the X-ray showing 4 foreign objects that never should have been inside me. I remember Patricia Osei risking her career to come forward because she knew someone had to stand up to a system that protected negligent doctors and profit-driven hospitals. I remember the jury that looked at all the evidence and decided that some mistakes are so egregious they deserve serious punishment. And I remember that I survived only because the next surgical team happened to notice missing instruments. If they hadn't, I would have gone septic at home, probably died within days, and Dr. Haverford would have continued practicing surgery, rushing through procedures, skipping safety checks, and eventually killing someone else. That's what justice means sometimes, not just compensation for harm done, but forcing systems to change, so the harm doesn't happen again to someone who might not be as lucky. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.